Welcome to View from the North on ThinkTech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today we'll talk about Canada and the US and how Canada is still fighting back. The battle is raging. Our guest for the show is Dr. Ken Rogers, retired Canadian businessman. Welcome to the show, Ken.
Hi, Jay.
Canada is our most important neighbor and trading partner. That's more clear now than it has ever been. And we need to keep track of the disruptions Trump is causing to that very special relationship. And we look to you to help us understand the continuing stress now between the US and Canada. So the first question, and we've discussed this in some detail before, is what is Trump doing, and just exactly how smart or stupid it is when he tries to impose tariffs against Canada?
Well, the first item is take a little bit on the effects. Canada is already suffering from Trump's policies. Just the creation of uncertainty has stopped a lot of things from happening. For example, our real estate market was just bubbling over at Christmas time, and it's now really in grim shape, that nobody wants to buy. Everybody's just scared to make a move. And you have, some things that make the policies look dumber than otherwise. For example, there is the president of the American company called Alcoa. They're headquartered in Pittsburgh, and they are one of the biggest aluminum providers in the world. Certainly important in terms of the automobile industry and everybody that uses aluminum. Well, they have three very large aluminum smelters in the province of Quebec in Canada, and those produce a huge amount of aluminum. Probably about half of what is exported from Canada to the United States comes from those three plants that are really part of an American company exporting to the United States. So one would wonder why, Trump would want to beat them up. Well, his theory is, well, they should just somehow move their production facilities into the United States. Well, that just doesn't really work very well. The president of the Alcoa made the following description, which was in the leading financial newspaper in Canada, and said to replace the three smelters which they have in the United States would require that the United States, in terms of the power, like electric power or equivalent to run a smelter, they would have to have 10 Hoover dams. Now, the Hoover Dam is the biggest dam in the United States. It produces more electricity than any other facility in the US. At least that's my understanding. Or alternately, if you take the largest nuclear reactors in the United States, it would take 7 of those just to produce the aluminum that this one company produces and exports to the US. That's not their whole production. The key to aluminum is it's located around the world wherever there is an abundance of inexpensive power. And the way to sort of better understand that is the raw material that you use for producing aluminum is found in all kinds of different places around the world. Like it's not, they don't have aluminum produced in Quebec because they have the raw material there. They bring the raw material from the far points of the world to the place in the world that has an abundance of inexpensive power. And so you really, aside from the US not having enough power, nor the willingness to produce, a whole bunch of nuclear power plants solely to in turn produce aluminum, that would be, spoils the economics of it. However, it also takes years to build a smelter. Like you take the raw material called bauxite and you bring it from some place like Jamaica, ship it all the way up to Canada, um, and then once that the use of the power is to produce the aluminum, then you ship the aluminum to somewhere where they're producing cars or whatever else. But really, it's something that it's really stupid economically for the United States to even think that's a possibility. Like it just, why would you suddenly ruin the car industry, by saying, we're going to have these humongous tariffs on your raw material, aluminum, and therefore people will stop buying cars, and we're going to break down the automobile trade industry where it's got lots of parts and materials going back and forth between Mexico, the U.S., and Canada, and simply because of a naive thought that you could have all of the smelting of aluminum done within the United States.
That's his theory on many things. It's not
Well,
just Canadian aluminum. He's got this whole thing about reshoring manufacturing, and sometimes you just can't do it. To say nothing about the effect on the American economy, to say nothing on the profound error of his thought process, where he says that that the Canadians and others are ripping us off. All they're doing is selling goods that we want to buy. So I think he's completely off base on that. But let me go further. So, okay, there was supposed to be this 25% tariff on Canadian goods. Is that in place? It was supposed to start already. Did it start?
no, but the effect is pretty dramatic because he didn't just have that one piece. He had the all steel and aluminum having the 25%, and that remains. And everything to do with automobile production and automobile parts similarly has that level. Well, those by themselves are pretty devastating because if you took automobile steel, aluminum, and auto parts, the trade between Canada and the U.S. in that regard is very, very important to Canada. The there, if you took those plus energy, you really have 2/3 of what Canada does export to the United States.
What has Mark Carney done in the last few weeks since you and I have spoken about these things? What countermeasures has he threatened? What countermeasures has he taken?
Well, importantly, you got to put in context that Canada has a federal election underway.
Mm-hmm.
And Mark Carney is, the Prime Minister of Canada or head of Canada, only until that election's done. Well, the main thing he's done is hoped that Trump would keep blithering the way he has, because Trump has, in effect, guaranteed he's going to be the Canadian Prime Minister, where if you took it last just around Christmas time, the Conservative Party in Canada was pretty well guaranteed that they would be the party in power, and that the Liberal Party, or Carney's party, the one that Justin Trudeau was previously the head of, they might not even become the official opposition. That is, in Canada, you have have 4 or 5 parties, but 2 major ones, but a third party has always had a significant part. Well, the Trump effect has been to um, take the people who would have voted for the little parties, saying, oh my goodness, if we're going to have the possibility of the conservatives, Trump-like people, I'm going to get in there and vote for the other guys. And so Mark Carney, should send thank yous to Trump for putting him in power, despite the fact that Trump's created an extremely difficult problem for him. But for Americans that may not know anything about Mark Carney, is everybody's heard the term, Rhodes Scholar, like Cory Booker, or there's several important Americans that are Rhodes Scholars, and that's sort of a measure of their brilliance. But in the case of Carney, his expertise, where he became a Rhodes Scholar, has to do with economics and finance, and his history. I mean, he worked for Goldman Sachs in the United States, a major role in that enterprise, and he's been governor of the Bank of Canada and governor of the Bank of England, which are the equivalents to the Federal Reserve in those countries. Well, no non-foreigner has ever been head of the Bank of England until it was Mark Carney. So you're sitting where, thank you to Mr. Trump, that we're going to have in Canada a prime minister that is a Rhodes Scholar economist with phenomenal amount of banking experience and a phenomenal amount of experience with high-level industry business in the United States. Now, that's really the reason why Canadians are going to elect him. I mean, the advanced polls are already underway in Canada. For example, I personally voted yesterday, but the last day, the main day of election, is next Monday, and Carney will probably win a substantial majority government, where in Canada we've had a minority government for a long time. I don't know if Americans know what's meant by minority government, but they may know a little bit about Israel. Well, when you have more than 2 parties in an election, then none of them may get a absolute majority. So if, for example, the Liberal Party in Canada, Mark Carney's, gets 40% of the seats, they have to depend on one of these splinter parties to make a coalition so they can govern together. And so it'd be nice in Canada to finally have a majority government, especially one headed by a professional economist with world experience.
It sounds like there's a timing issue here, and that Trump did the 90-day pause include a pause on the tariffs that he contemplates against Canada. I just wonder how much time Carney has to get in place. I wonder how much time Canada has to organize countermeasures. What does it look like?
The pause. One of the premiers in Alberta, premier from Alberta, rather, the premier in Canada, is also a conservative. And the province of Alberta is a little bit like Texas. It doesn't matter what you do, they're going to vote for conservatives anyhow. And that lady premier, she went to Mar-a-Lago, and it made the Canadian news that she had made it very clear to the Trump people that the more he was blithering and interfering in the election, the more likely that the Conservatives were going to get thumped or really beaten up. And so some of the press has been that Trump, because of that, was going to be quiet so that the party that's most like him would not get it, has a better chance of getting in. Well, all it's done was enhance the opposite. That is, if 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 there's any truth to the idea that Trump is being quiet in order to bias the Canadian election in favor of the Conservative Party, it's done exactly the opposite. And so it's really there. And one of the fun things in Canada is a lot of the press now have every day new jokes about Trump and Trump's stupidity and how it's affected the economy. And a lot of it is done to encourage Canadians, because the economic effect of what Trump's done already is already very severe for Canada. I mean, Canada hurts because of what Trump has done already, even though the policies aren't fully in place yet. It's one of the smarter economic thoughts I've seen lately was that Trump is so far been fairly successful in starting to destabilize the U.S. economy itself.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he
Now,
has.
it's past tense for Canada, like it's well done. It's hurting already, but if the United States, in particular, price inflation, if some of these tariffs start to be in effect and the prices start to rise, and it becomes really clear that the Republican Party in the U.S. is going to get booted out and beaten up pretty badly in the election next fall, this fall, then the U.S. policy would need to change. And the interesting thing is the quickest way to try to restabilize the U.S. would be to kiss Canada, because all of the items that he's doing that are going to cause the ridiculous inflation are really the stuff that he's doing to Canada and to a lesser extent to Mexico. If he'd have just left the North American trade agreement partners alone and just picked on Europe or China or Japan, the U.S. wouldn't be, starting to be destabilized.
He's not interested in doing the right thing. He just wants to show how powerful he is. And that takes me to the question of, what exactly do you think Mark Carney will do in the way of countermeasures? There's been discussion, and you and I have had discussion, at least theoretically, of deals and trading with Europe, even China. I don't know how long it takes to put those deals together. It sounds like it takes a bit of time. And of course, we already have countermeasures of people in Canada boycotting American goods, boycotting tourism. What else is there that Mark Carney or that Canada in general can do to make the point that Trump's tariffs are stupid?
Well, the most important item, Americans seem to miss, because of the geography of Canada being very, very long from east to west, and the topography of just the two countries, it's natural for a person in, say, Vancouver on the Pacific Coast area to do some trading with Washington State or Oregon or Idaho or California. They're a lot easier to go to and from than it is to even go from say Vancouver to Calgary, Alberta. The next province in, and that's like saying, well, why don't you go from say Seattle to the capital of Montana? well, gee, you got these a couple of mountain ranges in between, and it is not too easy to get to. It's a lot easier to go from from Seattle to Vancouver. And so there's natural trade. Now, similarly, if you go to in the middle and you took a place like Minneapolis, well, what's the nearest big city to Minneapolis? It's probably Winnipeg in the southern part of Canada. You may say, well, maybe they could make it to Chicago or somewhere, but still, there's a natural uh, inclination to trade north-south. Similarly, you get around the Great Lakes area, the shipping runs along the Great Lakes, and trade, they use the Great Lakes. Well, gee, Canada's on one side of it and the US on the other. And in fact, you can't get out of the Great Lakes without going through the St. Lawrence River from, past Montreal and out.
People in the US assume that it's a north-south paradigm, but it isn't. It's an east-west paradigm also. And they think maybe, that Canada cannot trade with Europe because it's not north-south, or cannot trade with Asia because it's not north-south. But in fact, Canada can trade east-west, right?
Oh, yes, and that's the main difference that is being promoted by all of the parties in the Canadian election, which basically Trump has dominated, or the Trump policies have dominated. There's in Canada, there's always been resistance to everything. That is, if you think in the United States you have trouble getting a pipeline approved or a railroad line approved or a highway approved going from across state lines, that's nothing compared to Canada, where we have not only the problem of the doing it physically, you've got all kinds of parties who interfere with the simple getting something done. For example, in Canada, the natives or the native Indians have a much bigger say than they even dream of having in the United States. So they can prevent a pipeline or things, reasonably easily. Well, what each of the parties have done is saying it's now in the national interest that we have better east-west trade. And in particular, one of the things that's really large in Canada are interprovincial trade barriers, so that something as simple as wine is produced, in the near Niagara Falls, let's call it, the Canadian side of that. And there's also wine produced in British Columbia. Well, you have trouble moving that wine across Canada. It's easier to get California wine in British Columbia than it is to get it from Ontario. Well, suddenly, and Mark Carney, would push that, and so the other parties immediately copied it, and they're all copying each other on how we can eliminate all interprovincial barriers to trade in Canada and create, an east-west kind of major utility barrier or corridor. For example, one of the biggest refineries in Canada is in southern Ontario, um, just across a bridge from, let's call it northern Detroit. If you took the northern suburbs of Detroit and you went across into Canada, you'd be at a city called Sarnia, very huge refinery. Well, how do you get the oil to that refinery? Well, it goes from Alberta west across a couple of provinces, and then it goes down into Minnesota, and then it goes across Wisconsin, and then jumps across the Great Lakes, where Lake Huron and Lake Michigan are joined. The very narrow passage, they've got a pipeline there that's about 50 years old, and the Michigan governor, uh, Gretchen Whitmer, I think is her name, has been trying to have that closed down. Well, it became very clear that it was in not just the Canadian national interest, but it was also the American national interest that you can't shut down that pipeline because it serves a couple of American refineries at the other end of the pipeline as well, important ones. That pipeline going back and forth across the American border was pretty important to this huge refinery in southern Ontario. Well, suddenly you get the political will in Canada to say, well, even though the just north of the Great Lakes is what the ground is called the Canadian Shield. And the reason there are virtually no people living immediately north of Lake Superior and let's call it the top of Lake Huron in Michigan, is because it's just sort of like an ancient mountain range. It's reasonably uninhabitable. Lots of minerals and things you can find there if you can get a road to get to them.
This sounds to me like what Elon Musk was doing. In other words, shoot and then aim. He didn't plan out the impact of the steps he was taking to terminate people. And likewise, Trump is in such a hurry to do these tariffs. It's an extension of his persona that he doesn't think about the implications. And only now, when people are thinking about the implications, people on both sides, they say, this is crazy. This is going to be damaging to both sides, and it will be damage that cannot be easily recovered from. And so your example is only one of many, I think, that will come to pass. I mean, we have a great interdependency with Canada and other countries, but especially Canada. And if we don't think this sort of thing through, then it turns into an economic disaster, which it is turning into right now. But I wanted to go to one other thing. I'm sure you get the same TV we get, and we get Rachel Maddow, several times a week, giving us footage of all the protests that are happening in this country. And that's largely about immigrants and migrants and the lack of due process and all that, but it's also about Canada. And I wonder what people in Canada think about those protests, because the Americans involved in those protests are saying, this isn't my decision. He's a crazy guy, and he's operating, without my confirmation, my buy-in, and he's going to damage both countries. How did that affect public opinion in Canada when they realized that most thinking Americans are with them?
Well, I don't think that any Canadians, or virtually any Canadians, think that the average American is friendly with and deserves to be friendly with Canadians. I mean, they're the most like Canadians of anybody in the world, including England, even though that's sort of the founding country for both of us. But the difference between what Trump is doing, Canadians are flabbergasted that he's able to get away with it and the protests are not larger. In particular, when you've got law firms bowing, kissing the ring, and sending fat checks, then Canadians just shake their head and say, how stupid are the Americans? Could we be that stupid? Because we're so similar to them. How can the average American not do more? And it's really surprising, but I tend to think that it'll be very long lasting, and you really have For example, who's most pleased with what Trump is doing? China and Russia, because I tend to think economics and security go somewhat hand in hand. Well, China's running around kissing everybody now. And just to use a dramatic difference, not very long ago when the United States wanted to keep out the Chinese electric vehicles, they immediately phone their buddies in Canada and say, how about working with us on this? And Canada immediately says, yes, our dear friends and good trading partners and people of whom we think, like thinking along, we'll immediately put 100% tariff on all these Chinese electric vehicles. So China, in a natural way, does a response. But the response against Canada hurts an awful lot more than the response against the United States. Like China cut off canola exports or not cut them off, but put a huge tariff against canola exports and against pork and seafood from Canada. Well, those were big exports. Well, Canada has about 25% of its GDP are its exports. Well, you can't, start kicking out some big export because it's a lot of Canadian jobs. Where in the US, the total exports are only like 15% or about 11% of the US gross domestic product. So there's a huge difference if you're going to cause a problem for Canadian exports. So here, friendly relations with the US, Canada's willing to take a kick in the groin. Well, then the next week, Trump starts his stuff. And what's China do? Well, they didn't remove the soybean, the tariffs that they put against Canada because we still had this, rejection of their electric vehicle tariff. So we get beat up because we were nice to the U.S. last week, and then the U.S. kicks us in the groin. And one would wonder, why does somebody think that this, will just be quickly forgotten? Well, China's running around right now, making on, envoys to Canada and Europe saying, well, since the United States is such rotten people and two-faced, and even their written contracts are no good, why don't you do some dealing with us? We're at least better than that. And they are.
I'm sure they find a lot of resonance on that. But let me also mention, and we talked about this before, there have been shocking incidents of Canadians who thought to visit the United States, and for reasons that were never explained to them, for reasons that were never clear or even understandable. At least 2 Canadian women that I've read about have been detained for a matter of weeks. Like one was 12 days in what amounted to a jail cell. And finally, one day, the Tom Homan and his minions in Department of Homeland Security, they released her without explanation. And she got on a plane and went back to Canada, really ticked off. And she talked to the press a lot about it, but she could not understand, and the press could not understand. Nobody could understand why Homan and Homeland Security had been so unfair and brutal to a Canadian without any reason whatsoever. And this must have an effect back in Canada, doesn't it?
Yes, the reaction here was really to say that that's exactly the same mental effect in Canada as the ICE people in the US rounding up people who've been in the United States for 10 years, have a green card. They don't care. They just grab them because, they're not white Caucasians with blonde hair or whatever, used to be Hitler's preference. But the news has been pretty clear, that the United States border people seem to have no better morals than Trump and the ICE people, and that the net effect of that is have greatly reduced the Canadians visiting the United States. Now, there were an awful
Wow.
lot of border cities, like saying uh, immediately south of Vancouver, uh, where, let's say there's nearly 4 million people in the Metro Vancouver, Lower Fraser Valley area that generally make several trips a year into Washington State. And one of the things that Canadians do is if they live really close to the border and they know there's a price differential between a product in the U.S. and a product in Canada. For example, Canada has supply management for milk and dairy products, a system that works very well for Canada and producers and keeps things pretty stable, but it results in the fact that a gallon of milk costs quite a bit more in the border cities in Canada than it does in the United States. So lots of people, drive across the border. It's only, a couple miles away in many instances, and they buy their milk and a few other things. Well, all of these border facilities that rely on Canadians are really hurting. There's a pretty nifty city in Washington State called Bellingham, which is about halfway between Vancouver and Seattle, and that there's tons and tons of people would make major trips to the Bellingham area, for purchases of things where the American market was, sufficient that had better prices than in Canada. Well, that business is really dramatically reduced. Canadians are not going to the U.S. and in part because of your description of the news made of Canadians not treated like Canadians used to be at the border.
Well, and Hawaii, very sensitive to tourism and very dependent on what is it? There's a term for this, the snowbirds, is it? The Canadians who want to come and go to the beach in the cold weather. And I'll bet you five that they're not coming so much anymore because they are concerned about running into the same kind of outrageous treatment that these two women were subjected to. It doesn't take too much to scare you off. And I think Hawaii will be affected by that.
Well, I thought that after a comment from my roommate that I would wear this shirt today instead of wearing a white shirt and tie. I thought I would wear a shirt from one of my favorite places in the world, Poipu Beach on on the one of the Hawaiian Islands, and just because I can't go to visit, it's not in my heart to go across the American border, while Trump is around and perhaps, less than I would otherwise do. I'm sure I'd have been in the U.S. in the last month or two if it hadn't been for Trump. And I'm not alone in that, but hopefully Poipu Beach is still there when it's worthy of Canadians visiting.
Well, if Canada remains strong and determined to make a point and have countermeasures and not bend a knee, if you will, to Trump, don't you think that Trump will have pushback in the United States over the economy? And that pushback will force him to back off. I mean, I'm giving him perhaps too much credit for rationality, but don't you think that this is indefensible and it's unsustainable what he's doing with regard to Canada?
Well, it's how much destabilization or wrecking of the American economy will it take? That's really the question. And I personally think that Trump will hang in there longer than than most experts think that he will, and for sure that he'll hang in there longer than he should. And it'll make a bigger mess to the U.S. economy. The effects around the world will be longer lasting, and that the Republican Party will get zapped in the election, Nick.
If you stop this process right now today, and you took stock of how Canadians have reacted, um, obviously there's damage done to this very important trading, and it's more than trading, it's a national relationship between the US and Canada, historical, very robust national relationship. If you took a snapshot right now today, what would have to happen and how long would it take to restore that relationship after Trump is gone?
Well, you used the phrase "after Trump is gone" because the important item is the United States cannot be trusted. Period. Absolute, no question. I mean, if you're going to use national security, fentanyl getting across the Canadian border as an excuse to throw thousands of Canadians out of work, do severe damage to the Canadian economy, who in their right mind would ever trust an American at all? I mean, you guys voted for this idiot, and there's nothing Canadians can do about it. I mean, they tend to think generally in Canada that Canadians and Americans have similar senses of values, but that's really been hurt. I mean, how could you be so stupid as to vote for that idiot? And he's doing the damage to you, but he's doing more damage to us at the same time. And you get rid of Trump, it'll take a long time to heal. One of the immediate things Trump wants to do, of course, would be renegotiate NAFTA or whatever, the USMCA or whatever, because Trump didn't like the name NAFTA because somebody else created it. However, how do you negotiate when the other guy's word is no good? The very guy you're negotiating with has proven his word is no good. And it doesn't matter. He wants to negotiate saying, I would like to ruin the automobile industry. I would like to ruin all of your steel production, all of your aluminum production. And I don't even like your oil and gas. That has to be one of the things that I had to laugh about. His drill baby drill, pitch. Certainly, there's no American company out drilling any more than they were. In fact, they're drilling less because the price of oil goes down as the world economy goes down, and Trump has caused the whole world's economy to shrink enough that the excess oil and gas, and Russia certainly helped by encouraging OPEC to, not restrain production, so that they shove a little extra oil up and then the US looks weak because of it, because the economy goes downhill.
Speaking of which, since you and I spoke last, we've seen the stock market, completely drop out. Incredible losses, trillions of dollars, which affects everybody's retirement account, in addition to all the threats over Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But the stock market itself has diminished retirement accounts across the board by trillions. And my question to you is, does this tell us that, there's a recession coming, or worse, that there's a depression coming? Or is it something that the economy will sort of be able to recover from and shrug off, Your thoughts?
It depends on what Trump does. It's that simple. If he hangs in, well, let's say no change from today, that is where major tariffs are scheduled to come on stream fairly soon. If any of those come on, I mean, I don't even mean all of them, the US will end up in a recession for sure if they're not already going that direction. Certainly Canada will be, and any major trading partner like Mexico will be, and it's only they get hurt more by what Trump has done than the US, which is why Trump psychologically thinks he's winning, is because the other guy hurts more than him, so maybe he can make a better deal. Well, nobody thinks he'll make a deal anyhow that he'd stand by, so why make a deal at all? But the U.S., if Trump follows through with some of these, large-scale tariffs that have been delayed, for sure the United States will have a recession. And the longer those things last and the larger they are, the deeper that recession will be. No, that's my opinion, but as but perhaps your listeners don't know that I do have a PhD in economics.
I know that, and that's why I asked you.
Well, it's just my personal opinion. It's certainly not an official Canadian opinion. However, Trump's just playing Russian roulette with the world's economy, including the American economy.
Well, things will change. They may change for the better, but that doesn't seem likely right now. They are likely to change for the worse, and a recession is always on the doorstep of a depression. So we'll have to leave it there for now, but we'll also have to come back to it and take the pulse of what he's doing and the effect it's having, not only on Canada, but on Mexico and on Europe and on Asia for that matter. Thank you so much to our guest, Ken Rogers, Dr. Ken Rogers, retired businessman, retired Canadian businessman. I'm Jay Fidell, host of View from the North. We've been discussing Canada and how it is still fighting back and will continue to do so. Thanks to our viewers for watching. We'll see you again soon for the next one. Aloha, Ken.
Or bye from Canada.